Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's a beautiful Tuesday here in the upper Midwest. It's supposed to get near 80 today, which is fine if the humidity stays low. These summers here in Minnesota can get quite muggy, which is quite unpleasant. I prefer a dry, clean air. Every chance you give me, I'll take the dry, clean air. Recently, I've been thinking about New Mexico. Wife wants to go somewhere south as we get older, and I'm like, I don't want to do Florida. I don't want to do California. Natural disasters, humidity, wildfires, mudslides. I mean, the whole thing. Earthquakes. Tsunamis. Dallas, Texas. I mean, I'm not interested in anything Gulf Coast at all. New Mexico, nice, clean, high mountain air, 4,000 feet elevation. I mean, perfectly blue skies, clean and crisp without being frigid. I mean, it can get cold, but New Mexico might be a good place to end up someday. But I'm working on a daunting project, and I'm actually going to appeal to some of you. Anyone wants to help me financially with this, because this is a big undertaking, and I've already thrown, years and lots of money at this, but I'm trying to get a better grasp of the Norman Granz empire. And most of you know I collect labels, and I've completed most of the significant labels in jazz: Savoy, Mercury, Argo, Riverside, Blue Note. And then there's different levels of complete. With Emercy, there's pretty much every title that they did as Emercy before they went back to being Mercury. I think I have every title. Savoy, I think I have everything in the first 150 titles. Blue Note, I have everything in the first, almost 450 titles, minus a few 10 inches from the earlier era, which is quite a different Blue Note. But each label, you kind of define what your complete's going to look like. Am I going to collect all the greatest hits and compilations and label comps and instrument comps? Am I going to collect the Christmas records? Am I going to collect, what am I going to collect? And with Blue Note, it was very finite. None of that stuff exists. It's just great album after great album. And so from 1500 through to 4273 or whatever it is, every title is pretty much right there in the pocket, what you want to hear, hard bopping. And there's a few off the wall titles. Most of y'all know how I feel about Cecil Taylor. And that Unit Structures is a unpleasant listen. For those of you who don't know, it's perfect music to throw furniture down a flight of stairs. That's what it's made for. Everyone's going to interpret that the wrong way. But for me, that's what I would play that music to do. But VERVE has been like a bit of a different beast. It's got two origin labels, Clef and Norgran. And Clef goes back to the days of the Jazz at the Philharmonic. And the days of the Jazz at the Philharmonic goes back to the late 40s. His early work, he was actually licensing to other little labels. The first Jazz at the JATP releases come out on Stinson, or sometimes a sister label of Stinson called Ash, AASCH, Ash. And then he starts licensing a lot of his early work, 10-inch stuff, with Mercury, and has Mercury pressing his work with still the Clef logos and stuff on there, but it says by Mercury. And somehow he retained the retention of that music. And most of them get repackaged as Clef or VERVE stuff without the Mercury. You can see actually you get some of the sticker of that covered over. So how exactly he ran his business and how he kept retention of stuff that he licensed other labels, and where his money came from. My good friend Jean-Michel Sebastian, he can answer some of that stuff for me. Reeser Beethoven, Jean-Michel Reeser Beethoven, he can answer some of those questions for me. He knew Norman a little bit, but knew many of the people who knew Norman pretty well. But some of the stuff's more businessy questions, even like once he gets Clef up and running, and there's a lot of 10 inches in the early 50s, some 78s in the late 40s, and then the LP era dawns with the 600 series. Well, that runs into the 750 or so. Turns out a lot of the last 30, 40 titles weren't released as Clef. A few in there were, but a lot of them end up coming out as the VERVE sequence instead. It does appear that he didn't record a lot of new music under the VERVE title when he first launches it. And why exactly does he launch the VERVE title? He has the Clef thing, and it's getting established. He has Norgran, which is a second imprint, which is just short for Norman Granz. And Norgranz has some incredible stuff on it with Stan Getz, Dizzy Gillespie, some amazing 10 inches, and then LPs as well. Going in at 54, 55, 56. Now, I know that he launches VERVE in part because he wants to sign Ella Fitzgerald away from Decca Records. And he manages in doing that and launches VERVE Records and records a lot of Ella, including those songbooks that we've talked about and stuff with Armstrong and a more commercially appealing Ella, well produced and arranged. And Norman's a multifaceted figure. He's a hero in some senses, but he's also a taskmaster in other senses. I mean, he was a great ambassador for the music and employed many African American musicians. And it's a who's who. Let's just be clear on that. From the JKP, Johnny Jazz and Philharmonic, from the dawning of that in the late 40s, into the sale to MGM, where he's eventually dismissed, and Creed Taylor comes in, he's housing so many important black jazz musicians. And the legacy of 8200 series, the 8300 series, and then the legacy of the late Clef Norgran stuff, which I'm still trying to get it all figured out. So I did a bunch of printouts of the different labels, and then I've been cross-referencing which ones are the same as this one. And a lot of cases here, he seems to be using the same covers, but not always. Illinois Jacket Moods has 2 issuings on the 600 series. I don't know why, with different covers. And then it gets reissued again in the 8000 series with the second 700 cover. I mean, it's a convoluted piece of construct, and I'm untangling that web. And I went through my Clef and Norgran stuff and highlighted that stuff, and then I'm going through my 8100 and 8000 series. Excuse me. And then the other thing that's difficult is that you end up having titles either in both sequences or in one or the other. And there's also, excuse me, a little bit of allergy season for me right now. I had a little sneeze there. But, so what also convolutes things is, aside from them being the Clef series and the Norgran series and the Ella 4000 series and then the 8000 series, there's a Pop 5000 series, which doesn't really interlope much with this. You do get a title once in a while by like a Sweets Edison. I mean, like, we'll cross over into that series, but you can almost dismiss the 5000. But there's a 2000 sequence. And the 2000 sequence has some Charlie Barnett. It has all the Oscar Peterson songbook stuff reissued on the 2000 sequence with a whole different set of covers. And I ended up collecting the Oscar Peterson 2000 sequence, not the Clef one. And so I got to figure out, I'll go through the Clef and give him a little half mark saying I got it, but I got it as a 2000. So it's like, it's a convoluted, twisted world. And it's hard to understand sometimes what his thinking was. He already owned Clef and Norgran outright, from my understanding. I don't know for sure that, but I'm pretty sure Clef and Norgran were his. And what was his impetus to start VERVE aside from signing Ella Fitzgerald? Did he have to re-sign and renegotiate the contracts with all his artists that were from Clef and Norgran? Was he trying to lose some of his artists from that period? You could have. Did his VERVE creation have different distribution channels that he negotiated? And so, because he launches that VERVE sequence sometime in 55, I think, maybe in the 56, and the Ella stuff starts coming on 55, 56. But the 8000 VERVE sequence has a sporadic little chunk of new material. But almost all of 8000, almost all of the 8100 sequence, almost 200 titles, is reissuings of Clef and Norgran titles. materials. And there's not this intermingling of new material in there as well, which is what you got at Prestige or what you got at Blue Note. You'd have them reissuing some stuff from the 70, 80 RPM era, a couple 10 inches would be coupled together on an LP, and the next LP would be new material. The next LP might be a new material. And the next LP might be, again, some 10 inches that were coupled together. And that's how most of these labels out. Bethlehem, when they launched their LP series, couple up like 18, 10 inches on the 9 LPs and start their sequence with that. But again, then you have mismatched albums with two different artists on each side. And so there's different ways to approach this LP dawning in 55, 56. It seems like Norman Granz, for some business choice, maybe a tax thing, launches Verve, signs Ella, starts at 4,000, reissues most of his Clef and Norgran's significant artist titles, and it seems like it's most of the artists that he's keeping in his full roster of musicians. Reissues almost all their stuff on the Verve label, 80,000, 8100 sequence. And then at late 81, 96 or so, we start getting some new material. And there is a few things in the 8,000 sequence, maybe 7, 8 titles that looks like it's new. But these things I'm printing off from Wikipedia aren't always complete. So sometimes maybe this record that has no link to its Norgran or Clef predecessor, maybe someone just hasn't added that information in there yet. So it's a convoluted thing that I'm trying to suss out. And I've made a lot of progress, boy. I felt like an archaeologist student, just nose to the books and highlighting and pulling stuff out. And and I have probably close, maybe even over 700 verbs now, which includes Clef and Norgran. And what's really exciting, I've been on a bit of a buying spree. Spent probably $1,000 on some Verve titles I didn't have, including a few I could have swore I did have that were ones that you just like. There's some Jerry Mulligan stuff from the 83, 8400 sequences that I swore I had them, but there's a few other covers of his that look almost similar, a couple of saxophone drawings on them, and I only didn't have all of them. I only had a couple of them, and luckily some of that stuff's really cheap. And so I would appreciate some help if anybody wants to help me build this archive so that I can further explain it and help those who want to understand the Verve canon, because I have all the information and the pieces. And it's one thing to do the research, it's another thing to have the artifacts. When you have the collection, when you have the LPs, so if anybody wants to help donate to this cause, send me a message, hit me up in PayPal. I mean, hit me up in YouTube, Facebook, you can connect with me. And, you know what I mean, pledge $20, pledge $50. People often just send money to support. And so, I mean, there's no obligation here, obviously. But if you want to help me build this Verve canon and finish it off. And the question kind of becomes here, how far do I go? It's surprising how with the 8,000, 8100 sequence, when I highlight in all the stuff I have in those sequences on Verve, plus add in the Clef and Norgran titles that I have that were also issued in those sequences, kind of put a half line there and say, okay, I have it, but it's on Clef. There's actually not a lot of things I'm missing. I mean, it's pretty impressive how much, especially with the about 50 or 60 records I've bought in the last 3 weeks, which a lot of them are still showing up in the mail. A lot of them are from the 8200 sequence. I'm almost done with that sequence, 8200 sequence. And once I'm done, I'm going to show you how great the Verve 8200 sequence is. And it further elevates, in my mind, the greatness of 1957 and 1958 in jazz. It's just an unprecedented time. A time of the LP coming into its full fruition as a tool and how to record it as a unit session, to have a unified feel on a record, to the new militancy coming out of the post-war hard-bop movement, the social consciousness of it. There's just an elevated feeling of intensity, and things have changed happening in 57, 58 that sometimes what I hear in the 60s is more artificial. I mean, it's not to say there wasn't still chaos. Obviously there was. But some of that 60s stuff that's trying to be socially charged can feel a little bit staged, a little bit, I don't know, hard to describe. But there's a tenacity and something real and really innocent still in its stages that's developing in jazz at that point, musically and emotionally and consciously and spiritually and politically and socially. There's just a change happening. And the music itself is kind of grafting away from the swing era, away from the bebop frenetics, and moving into back to the blues and the groove and the feel, and hard bop's reestablishing some of that blues and gospel elements. The small groups are allowing the call and response and some of the interaction and listening and hearing and responding. There's just a real freshness. There's a sterility that comes with the swing age towards the end of it, where it was so sterile, it was so prepackaged, it was so much the same songs. Everybody knew what was going to come next. And Coleman Hawkins strips a lot of that away with Body and Soul and says, okay, here's the melody. I'm going to state the theme, but now I'm just, and that's from 39, I think it was. And Body and Soul by Coleman Hawkins, it's one of the landmark pieces in jazz. And of course, the war comes in, recording ban happens, things are changing, bebop revolutions are happening in the streets. But as we move towards the end of the 40s, into the 50s, the cool is starting to happen with different instrumentation, slower tempos, chordal arrangements overlapping on top of the jazz at times. The cool bop on the West Coast was a fun interpretation of hard bop. A lot of fun things are happening in 57. 56 is a great year, but it's kind of a transition. 57 and 58 are just like, and then 59 and 60 are like the counterpoint. It's like they're just as great. It's like this 4-year moment where jazz blossoms almost like it's the end of the season and the harvest is due. By 1960, I mean, it's the fruit is ripe. This is as good as the moment's going to get. And the bruising and the overripeness will start to set in jazz as every other facet of the music world supersedes it. And jazz falls into the decay of bygone musical eras. But boy, it blossoms in 57, 58, 59, and 60. And there's a freshness and a tenacity and an aggression and an excitement that you feel in jazz in 57, 58. And so when you get to see these biographies of each label and chronicleize, is that a word, chronicleize? But when you chronologically see what's happening at each label at that time, it's an exciting time. And Verve has its hands on the throttle. And the Blue Note Cannon's unrivaled from 57, 58. Prestige is doing incredible stuff. Riverside's in full swing. Savoy's mixing up some older stuff and still getting some new material in there. That's part of the 55, 56 conundrum. Is a lot of that material from those eras is repackaged stuff from earlier eras being introduced on the LP era, which waters down that 55, 56 window and puts a lot of material in there that you're not really sure of its origins initially, and it gives you disparate sounds that sometimes you'll think, oh wow, this is... Man, 55 had a lot of weird things happening when that's really a session from 51. I mean, some of the Sonny Rollins, some of the Thelonious Monk, some of that Prestige stuff in the early 50s that gets repackaged on LP, it doesn't really fit with what's happening in 55, 56 with Clifford Brown and the Miles Davis Quintet. Things are changing. And the modernity of post-bop is kind of swept over by the power of hard bop. And these cats at Verve, it's a who's who, as I've said many times, of the greatest talent in jazz. Your Billie Holidays, your Charlie Parkers, your Ella Fitzgeralds, your Lester Youngs, your Ben Websters, your Coleman Hawkins, your Sweets Edisons, your Roy Eldridges, your Ray Browns, your Oscar Petersons, your Art Tatums. It's just, the list goes on and on and on. It's the most incredible assemblage of talent. And Norman is giving these guys work, paying them to record almost relentlessly. And a question for you, Jean-Michel, if you watch, who do Norman Granz love more, Art Tatum or Oscar Peterson? And who is the greater talent? Boy, that's not an easy question to answer. And and he records infinite Tatum stuff. And he records infinite Oscar Peterson stuff. And they're two of the greatest piano players in history without any doubt. And Norman obviously had a big place in his heart for both of them, it would seem. Although from everything I've heard, he's not the most personable person in some ways. He was a business guy. I think he can be distant at times. He's a hard taskmaster. Like, these guys were working. They were his prize. I don't want to say cattle, but like he was definitely an ambassador for these black musicians. But he also said, it's time to record now, guys. Come on. Let's get to work. So he was in charge of things. And there's some great white talent there as well. The Stan Getzes and the Flip Phillips, and I mean, it's the trombone player Bill Harris. It's the guitar player Todd Farlow, or Herb Ellis. I mean, it's the list of talent. It's profoundly insane. It's profoundly insane. And these guys know what's happening in jazz around them. It's not like a Lester Young, a Coleman Hawkins. And Hawkins is on some of the most important recordings of the late 50s. He's right there with the changing of the guard. And of course, we lose Parker in 55. Clifford Brown passes in 56. He was never a Verve guy, but he still impacted what happens in jazz. And these guys knew. I mean, Lester Young's, the Ben Websters, the Coleman Hawkins, they could hear what was happening with the younger kids. And they added some of that modernity to their playing, but they kept that blues and gospel and that swing and the wisdom of the old fella. And you could sit on these guys' knee and be told something about the times that we live in. And boy, it's just an important chapter in jazz history. And he puts Tatum and Peterson both with a lot of different combinations of players as the anchor of sessions. And I've been kind of listening to some of the Tatum stuff he does with Ben Webster and Charlie Ventura. Benny DeFranco, sorry. Benny DeFranco has a lot of records in this area as well. An Italian guy from Philadelphia, if I remember. Fantastic clarinetist. Probably the greatest modern clarinetist of that era. Goodman's kind of receded. Artie Shaw's kind of, older dance parties, and he left the business at one point. It's really Benny DeFranco that's kind of at the front of the clarinet scene and does some fantastic stuff in the late 50s at Verve. A lot of stuff. And he's a guy that gets stuff in the 2000 sequence and the Clef sequence and the 8000 sequence. And again, it's easy to buy the same Benny DeFranco record, but it does seem like most of them are separate recordings. Each one of these guys has so much work at Verve, Clef, Norgran. It's an amazing. Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy has so much work at Verve. And so you're just talking about a who's who. And I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. The kids at Blue Note, my kids in their 20s and their 30s, probably in the 40s for some of them, older guys like Duke Pearson and Ike Quebec. Quebec was probably in his 50s even. But those guys at Blue Note in 57, 58, 59, 60, they're all anonymous. Jackie McLean might have some renown, but not much. Donald Byrd, Hank Mobley, Lee Morgan, pretty much unknown. On a national radar, unknown. And talking to people who come in here who like jazz, there's two camps. There's the modern revisionist camp who loves Miles Davis and everything Miles Davis affiliated and doesn't know much beyond that. And then there's the old cats who come in who used to love jazz when they were kids, sitting around listening to Stan Kenton. And it's a shocking thing how those cats in their 70s who used to be in the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines, and they played in the jazz bands and they love dancing to the jazz music, and they know that swing era stuff, but they know nary a black musician. We think of Count Basie and Duke Ellington as these anchors of the swing era. And let me tell you, most of these old white cats who've come in here to talk jazz with me can't tell you shit about a black player. They might remember Basie's name or Ellington's name, and they probably even know that Goodman and some of those guys did Basie Ellington songs, but they didn't collect it, they didn't buy it. You didn't buy black music for the most part if you were white American, even if you loved that music. There's one guy comes in who followed Kenton around, has photographs of him in L.A. and Vegas and Minnesota and La Crosse. He has this whole scrapbook of Woody Herman stuff. Oh, sorry, Stan Kenton stuff. There's another guy comes in, the hugest Woody Herman fan. But when I try to discuss jazz in a broader sense, their only knowledge is of the White Cats. It's amazing how many White Cats know Maynard Ferguson. And then you have the next level of kind of fringe jazz fans from the 50s and 60s, older people again, who are like, do you have any Al Hirt? And I mean, Al can play, but it's like, it's the saccharine, and Eric Dolphy's unknown. John Coltrane, not part of their landscape. And so that just drives home the point how much these anonymous black musicians were to the American music landscape in the late 50s, early 60s. However, the exceptions were these guys at Verve. The Verve label had good distribution compared to the Blue Notes, the Prestiges, the Savoys, the Riversides. Verve was national. They're not as hard to find as those records by any means, or as expensive to collect. I mean, it's just really difficult and broad. And I'm filling it in, I'm getting to know it, I'm getting to be able to cross-reference it. And like I said, the stable of musicians he has is just, it's insane. And why did he record or re-release all that stuff on the Verve label when it's already there on the Clef imprint that he already owned? Did he have a different negotiation with how much he was going to make as a percentage off the Clef stuff versus the Verve stuff? Because to reissue on your 8,000 sequence, 200 records you've already put out. It's more like 180. But still, that's your first business of duty, is to reissue all the stuff you did already. And to sprinkle a few things in that are current, mostly on the 4,000 sequence with Ella, and a few titles here and there, a Ray Brown title. I mean, there's a few that are sprinkled in there. But there's like a stretch of 5 or 6 early in the 8,000, another stretch towards the end of the 8100 sequence. But pretty much everything else in there is Clef and Margaret. And so what was his impetus? What was his drive to have to repackage all that? And it seems like he almost puts recording new material on hiatus in 55 and 56, even though that Ella stuff's happening. Some of the Art Tatum and Oscar Peterson stuff's happening. And it also seems as though he continued after Verve was launched to issue most new material on Clef and Norgran into 55, maybe even into 56, with the intent of it eventually being reissued in the Verve sequence. And like I said, most of the end of the Clef 700 sequence, which it starts at 600 and runs into 700, most of those last 40, 50 titles weren't reissued on Clef, but most of them were issued on Verve. And so I'd be interested to know some of these questions to help me better understand. I mean, it's a fun, rich subject matter because you're delving into some of the most important artists in the history of this music. Some of these players are the influence on everybody who played after them. Your Ben Websters and your Coleman Hawkins and your Lester Youngs. It's hard to pick up a saxophone and not emulate those guys. Real hard. So, I mean, I'm loving it. It's been a fascinating, consuming look at all of it. And then the other thing you have to factor in here is DSM. David Stone Martin does a lot of these album covers, which makes some of the repackagings almost worth having just for the David Stone Martin cover. And I mean, he's a pretty legendary figure in graphic design and jazz, and just people collect some of his records just for his artwork. I'm actually a bigger Burt Goldblatt fan myself, but it's neck and neck. I mean, I just love some of Goldblatt's photography work as well, which really adds another layer to what some of Goldblatt's work does. David Stone Martin stuff almost always has a vintage feel to it. It feels like something you would see in the New Yorker magazine in 1953. It's got a kind of a classic, almost throwback to something Parisian even at times, like some of the line drawings on the cafes and the street lamps. It's just got a bistro feel at times. Some of the Goldblatt stuff looks completely modern now. Some of that stuff he does at Storyville for the Connets covers with the ocean, the blue and the green, and some of the Bethlehem photographic covers. They're just completely modern. It could be some chick solo record today. They're just incredible. But David Stone Martin adds a whole nother layer to this, because collecting his art and collecting his graphic design and seeing how much what Goldblatt and David Stone Martin were impacting graphic design and music and jazz. It's pretty fascinating stuff. And I'm getting to the point now where I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of titles left in the 8,000 sequence that I'm like, oh, I've never seen that one before. And there's been a few in these last few weeks. I'm like, oh, crap. I don't think I've ever seen that. Which is weird, because I search jazz, and most of my searching on Discogs, I put in a time limit from 1950 to 65. So I'm looking for those 15 years, and you would think that some of these Verve titles would have shown up by now. But, I mean, there's some pretty rare ones, some pretty obscure ones. And, again, there's also the fact that the Japanese have reissued some of these things. Some of them got reissued on Columbia in Europe, which, again, kind of twists up how this all looks. But I just could use a little help financially with this. I don't have a ton to go, maybe 100 titles left. And most of that's going to be Clef Norgran stuff. And most of that's going to be stuff that Clef and Norgran didn't get repackaged onto Verve. Most of the stuff that has that Verve crossover, I think I have most of that. There's a few things that I'm watching on Discogs right now, and waiting to make an offer and see how I feel about certain things. I mean, there's probably between 8,000, 8,100, 8,200, 8,300. There's maybe 40 titles in there I don't have. And some of them are collections and greatest hits and piano anthologies, and most of the important titles I've collected. But I'm still kind of filling some of that in. But again, there's some Clef and Norgran stuff I do want to get a hands on. And if anybody wants to pledge any money to help me build that archive, to help me understand it, to help me talk about it, and help you understand it better as well. And if no one feels that's appropriate, that's totally okay as well. But like I said, people do all of a sudden send me 20, 40, 50 bucks. Not often, but frequent, you know. And so if anybody feels the spirit, cheers to them. And it'll go to a good cause, helping put more sheep in the pen. Because I'm the jazz shepherd, and this is my flock. I'm over 6,000 jazz LPs at this point. I had a lot of fun filling in the 10-inch stuff in the last few years. And there's still more 10-inch stuff I need to delve into. And sadly, I'm actually running out of room here in my jazz cabinets. I didn't think that would ever be an issue. But as my knowledge grows and my collection expands, we're nearing the end of the shelf capacity. And I'm not sure what's going to take place after that. So anyway, that's today's episode. I just wanted to talk to you about what I've been working on. And I think it's a fun subject, an interesting subject. Super, super highly evolved form of jazz, laced with the blues, laced with the black church, laced with the social revolution that's happening. It's all reflected in a calmer, gentler, older, wiser man here at Verve in 57 and 58. And Lester knows what's going on. Ben knows what's going on. They all know what's happening in the streets. They're just a little less militant and a little more coy about how they want to talk about it and phrase it and share about it. And part of them just wants to ride out their last years and love life and live it. You know, at some point, war becomes a young man's game. And so they definitely are aware of what's happening in the black community. And it comes off just as charged and just as poignant and just as necessary, just as urgent. And I guess it's the urgency of 57, 58 Blue Note that drew me in to such an extent that extends into the 60s for Blue Note and many other labels as well. But it's the urgency I feel in some of these 57, 58 Verve records. There's some just powerful blues-filled The Lord is My Shepherd prayer and contemplation and serenity and solitude and just blankets to wrap myself up in. You can feel these men. This music was a spiritual entity. It was a thing that protected them. And it was a place that it might be work someday. Norman Granz might be cracking the whip and working our asses off. But I can always put that horn in my lips and let that gospel that salvation wash over me. And by darn it, if magic didn't end up happening on so many of those records, I mean, Norman Granz either knew what he was doing or got real lucky. Because, man, they find some incredible moments. And just beautiful, a lot of high-level listening. And musicians will tell you, you're as good a player as you are as a listener. Being a good listener is an important part of being a musician, and it's the utmost of importance as a jazz musician. Being a listener comes with age and wisdom, and to take in your setting and the emotional context of your compatriot, and then to complement that. And boy, they seem to be in lockstep on so many of these sessions, and the rhythm sections that Norman has playing, whether it be Art Tatum led, whether it be Oscar Peterson led, whether it be Teddy Wilson led. I mean, and you just keep thinking of names like that. He was there too. He was there too. And it just goes on and on and on. And Stan Getz makes some incredible records. He was going through his drug era in a lot of recordings. It's really an incredible time. So I'm going to wrap it up at that. Appreciate you all. My name is Dan, the Jazz Shepherd. This is my little coffee shop cafe where we listen to jazz and talk about the world. And hope you all stay safe and have a great day. If you want to support this channel, please subscribe. Hit that like button. If you want to support the channel by virtue, please go to my Patreon page and pledge, $5 a month. And if you want to help me finish this jazz sequence, reach out to me and I'll happily accept your honorable pledge to help me finish off that archive. Because to be honest, it's gotten quite expensive. At some point, I'll have to be like, tell my wife something. Oh yeah, but I had people helping me buy it. If I get 3 pledges that will help me buy records, that's a nice little tidbit to throw at my wife. I mean, am I obsessive compulsive at times? Yeah. Do I like to get to the bottom of things and understand things before I speak about them? Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of how I like to look at things, whether it was geography or history or sport. I mean, all my obsessions, I get to know them so well that I feel comfortable speaking on them in a fluent manner. And things I don't know too much about, you won't catch me speaking up on a whole lot. I'm not talking about carburetors, and it's not what I know. Not what I know. There's other people who could fill that niche. Anyway, be blessed. Appreciate you all. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.